one from screw-top bottles. So knowing that, and in those kinds of more sober, surroundings, in a more sober situation, as it were, they were still picking the corked wine. All these participants, they just preferred it, Belinda.
Oh, well, it's a strange thing. From what I saw, I thought that they were actually, obviously they couldn't see the wines as to which one came out of a cork bottle and which one came out of a screw cap bottle. But my understanding was that they were able to hear...
Yeah, that's right.
The sort of precursor to it being poured was the fact that it had come out of a corked bottle or a screw cap. So therefore they knew which was which, but not what the wine was necessarily.
Sorry, I may have explained that badly, and you just have explained it well. Yes, that's precisely right.
Yeah. So therefore I think we're still saying that it could have been the fact that the pop of the cork was giving them the equivalent effect to that mouth-watering thing. When you smell something yummy, your mouth starts to water. Maybe the sound of that cork was doing the same thing, giving a subliminal suggestion that was going to be the better wine. And to be honest, I think it's not about better or worse in the case of this study. It was about preference on style, which is something else and then can be debated forever and ever and ever.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. But I do think a lot of it's perception. Certainly with the US market, for example, who are very, very slow to adopt screw caps because they are a very traditional conservative market who are firmly entrenched in what they believe to be that quality wine must have a cork in the end of it. Now, at the end of the day, cork is centuries-old technology. It's not even technology, really. And it's tree bark that can be affected with a compound called TCA, trichloroanisole, which the cork industry have not been successful at eradicating. So when you buy a bottle of wine that's filled with a cork, it's a bit like Russian roulette, or if you buy a case and you pull out a bottle, there may well be one of them in there that is not necessarily affected just by TCA, which is quite a nasty, musty, dank sort of character. But the other issue with cork is the nuggets. You blow the chicken bit apart and then glue it all back together, and for some reason that's applied with cork. But anyway, I digress. Yeah. I digress. Don't mix your chicken nuggets with the cork.
And then you cork the wine with the chicken nugget.
You stick the chicken nugget in the wine bottle.
Exactly. And now you're going to ask me what wine goes with chicken nugget.
None.
I've got to go, Belinda.
Oh, you got to go. At the end of the day, screw caps are definitely better for the wine.
All right. I'll use that as a summing up. Belinda favours screw caps on wine bottles. Barry Corbett, lovely to have your company today. Thank you so much.
All the best.
Irene Gardner, the same applies to you. Very nice of you to come in.
Thank you, Jim.
That's us. We are back tomorrow as usual, everybody. Thank you for listening. And John Campbell on Checkpoint now.
Kia ora everyone. Tonight on the programme, all eyes on the New Zealand First Board and Caucus who are still locked away at Parliament considering the proposals from National and Labour and their response to them. The death toll in Mogadishu from 2 truck bombs is now well over 230 people. A devastating attack targeting civilians. Auckland's Waterview tunnels, the country's most expensive roading projects, proving to be a lucrative cash cow when it comes to speed camera fines. Young Mr. Kurtz, at 31, he looks set to become Austria's leader, but who is he and what does he want? And keeping up with the librarians, a little bit of magic out of Invercargill. All of that and more coming up after Anna with the news.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Good afternoon, I'm Anna Thomas. The Waikato District Health Board has apologised unreservedly to the family of an elderly man who died in July 2013. The Health and Disability Commissioner says the 78-year-old waited more than double the optimal time for hip replacement surgery. Anthony Hill says the DHB has acknowledged it could have cancelled elective surgery to fit him in. The Executive Director of Waikato Hospital Services, Brett Paradine, says the board accepts the findings and has apologised.
That delay was completely unacceptable, and we've gone to a lot of measures to improve the timeliness of surgery, but certainly the clinical advice I've had is that wasn't the cause of this patient's death. Having said that, it was completely unacceptable.
The Waikato DHB's Brett Paradine. A Salvation Army analyst says the sale of most of Tauranga's social houses to a private provider has created a monopoly that's not subject to public scrutiny. The Ministry of Social Development is looking at long-term housing options for a seriously ill man who's been evicted by Accessible Properties, which bought more than 1,100 Housing New Zealand homes in Tauranga in March. The IHC subsidiary has evicted a man on dialysis who's now living in emergency accommodation in a motel. Timothy Dalton Edwards says Accessible Properties would not find him another home despite his assurance meth contamination detected in his property had been caused by a boarder. Analyst Alan Johnson says cases like his were inevitable following the housing takeover.
Housing New Zealand, I think because the public agency was subject to some scrutiny and some direction from, say, for example, ministers, whereas Accessible Properties is a law unto itself. It can get away with that.
Alan Johnson of the Salvation Army. Nearly $1 million worth of speeding fines have been issued at Auckland's Waterview tunnels in a little over a month. The police operate 4 speed cameras at the twin 2.4 kilometre long tunnels, one at each entrance and exit. Figures given to RNZ under the Official Information Act show just under 9,800 fines worth $948,000 in total were issued between July the 21st, when the cameras were turned on, and August the 31st. The police say the fines show too many people are speeding through the tunnels, so the cameras are here to stay, as it is a current 80 km/h speed limit. The New Zealand First Board and caucus continue to meet behind closed doors at Parliament as they assess the policy concessions offered by Labour and National. Board members have flown into Wellington from around the country so the party chiefs can decide which party they want to form a government with. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
There were communications between New Zealand First and Labour and National over the weekend, but those discussions were still about policy and fiscals. Ministerial positions and governing arrangements were not discussed with either party. The New Zealand First leader, Winston Peters, won't say whether the board will make a final decision today or when an announcement about the new government could be expected. All he'll say is that the announcement will be made before the end of the week. Atuiti whare parimata, ko Chris Bramwell aho.
WorkSafe New Zealand and the police are investigating the death of a truck driver in a workplace accident at a quarry near Tauranga this afternoon. The driver's truck and trailer unit rolled at the Tauranga quarry in Welcome Bay just before 2 o'clock. The accident happened while the truck was emptying gravel. Today's death brings the total number of quarry fatalities since 2011 to 6. The head of Austria's Conservative People's Party, Sebastian Kurz, is on course to become the youngest national leader in the world after his victory in the country's general election. The 31-year-old, who is a former foreign minister, has revitalised a tired Conservative Party since becoming its chairman in May. Speaking to his supporters, Mr Kurz pledged to transform his country and take a hard line on migration. His party may end up striking a coalition deal with the far-right Freedom Party, which came a strong third in the election. The owner of the land where the Marsden pipeline broke, disrupting jet fuel supplies and travel plans for thousands, is remaining elusive. Local authority records show Linton Hardley McMullen owns the lifestyle property where a digger is believed to have damaged the pipeline. The Northland Regional Council has been calling Mr McMullen, but he's not picking up the phone. The council's regulatory manager Colin Dowell says staff have left a message on Mr McMullen's voicemail and will also write to him. Mr Dowell says the council can't compel Mr McMullen to respond. It's 5:05. The All Blacks flanker Sam Cane says he has ambitions to captain the Chiefs for the foreseeable future, though he won't admit to holding the same aspirations for the national side. Cane has re-signed with New Zealand Rugby for another 4 years until the end of 2021. The 25-year-old has co-captained his Super Rugby team the past 2 years and says he's ready to take on the full-time skipper's role. However, despite standing in as All Blacks captain twice, he's not thinking about leading his country just yet.
Here at the Chiefs, certainly. I enjoy my captaincy role here. I think in the All Blacks, my main focus is just about playing well. So I feel like I've still got plenty to achieve. I'm only 25. Hopefully can bring up my 50th next time I wear the jersey, but I still feel there's plenty I got to achieve.
And Kane is set to play his 50th test in this weekend's third and final Bledisloe Cup clash in Brisbane. Meanwhile, Canterbury first five Richie Mo'unga has been called into the All Blacks squad as temporary cover for Beauden Barrett, who's suffering symptoms from the head knock he sustained against South Africa last weekend. Ticket prices for New Zealand's Football World Cup Intercontinental Playoff against Peru in Wellington next month have been set, with adults paying between $59 and $129 a seat. Children's ticket prices start at $29 and go as high as $79 for platinum seating. Pre-sale tickets open tomorrow, while general public tickets go on sale on Friday. And Australian Supercars boss James Warburton has announced he's stepping down at the end of the year following 4.5 years in the top job. And that's the news.
California burns.
An eerie combination of a cemetery and a scrap metal yard. It's just very strange, very Halloween-y, but ultimately very tragic.
Doctors with burnout.
We are not doing enough. We should be doing more. And there's definitely some anger saying that we need to do more. One suicide is one too many.
And how to avoid a burning asteroid.
We could deflect it. We could send a spacecraft there to perhaps ram into it.
Facing the heat, Guyan Espiner and Susie Ferguson. Morning Report, weekdays from 6.
Then after 9, news as it happens. In-depth conversations with world-leading experts and the latest trends you need to know about. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Now, looking at the short forecast from Met Service until midnight tomorrow. Northland to Manawatu, including Coromandel Peninsula and the Central High Country, along with the Bay of Plenty. A mix of sun and clouds with isolated afternoon and evening showers. Gisborne to Wairarapa, also Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast and Wellington. Fine spells, isolated showers spreading north, clearing for a time tomorrow morning and afternoon. Nelson and Marlborough, excluding the Kaikoura coast, isolated showers clearing them mainly fine. For the Kaikoura coast and Canterbury, cloudy with isolated showers becoming fine tomorrow morning, but a few showers developing from the afternoon. For Otago and Southland, mainly fine today, but showers everywhere tomorrow morning, but they will clear in the Southern Lakes, Central Otago and North Otago regions in the afternoon. Buller to Fiordland, mainly fine, but a few showers for you too tomorrow. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a few showers. It is 8 minutes past 5 and you're listening to Checkpoint with John Campbell.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna Thomas. Nicely done too, with no working earpiece, which is a strange sensation.
It is, it's quite weird,
yeah,
but there we go.
Not hearing yourself. Lovely work. Thanks everyone for being with us. Coming up on the programme tonight, Mogadishu and the terrible, terrible truck bombings there. That's next. Later, the wildfires in California. Also tonight, the Waterview tunnel speed cameras. Ka-ching! But we begin tonight outside the discussions being held by the New Zealand First Caucus and Board in Wellington. Winston Peters did offer up last Thursday as his own deadline, but the fact is discussions do routinely take this long and longer in those democracies where governments are built by coalition. Nonetheless, there was great excitement when an email flashed into our inbox at 4:22. NZ First Discussions was the title. It was 2 lines long, and the second line read, and I quote, "It's expected the meeting will go on for several more hours." It does seem that policy concessions and inclusions have more or less been settled, or at least that the offers are received and understood. But now which side to go with, and ministerial positions and governing arrangements are being settled upon, we think. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
What brings you here today?
Well, we've got a scheduled cabinet meeting and I have some tea to make, potentially.
So more negotiations with Mr Peters today?
The Finance Minister, Stephen Joyce, like the rest of the country, is in a holding pattern as New Zealand First continues its process of deciding whether to form a government with National or Labour. Members of the party's board and its caucus all arrived in Wellington this morning to consider the policy concessions offered by both parties.
Yeah, looking forward to meeting with the board. We all went back to our respective tūranga waiwais. I went back up north and I think there's a good opportunity for the board and the caucus to meet.
Look, we'll have to go up and see what's been discussed over the weekend. There's a lot of clarification was needed, so there's a lot to get through, so I wouldn't expect
Nationals leader Bill English says there were discussions over the weekend about various aspects of a deal, but there are still areas that haven't been talked about yet.
Well, there would still need to be discussion about the nature of the governing arrangement, ministerial positions, the way that parties would interact. So those discussions are still ahead of us. I mean, we'll be looking to get a proposition that we could put to our caucus and our board in the same way the New Zealand First are having a discussion today.
Mr English says whether or not there's an announcement later today or tomorrow remains to be seen.
I mean, sometimes things you think will be straightforward turn out not to be. Other things turn out to be much more straightforward. So I wouldn't want to put it, we're not putting deadlines on it. We certainly want to get on and get the process completed. I think the public are expecting the formation of a government pretty shortly.
When the man of the moment, Winston Peters, arrived at Wellington Airport this morning, he had little to say to reporters.
Will the board make its decision today, Mr Peters? Do you expect it to make its decision today? Do you expect it to make its decision today, or will it go into tomorrow?
Look, I've already answered that.
So will we have an announcement at the end of today?
I've already answered all those questions.
Well, can you just remind us, will the board make its decision today?
Well, if you've been struck down with amnesia, I can't help you, mate.
Bill English said this morning there were no ministerial positions discussed over the weekend. Do you expect those discussions to happen tonight after your board's met?
Well, I heard his interview and he was telling the truth.
And is it the same situation with Labour as well? I mean, are both negotiations at the same point with both parties?
Well, obviously he couldn't answer for Labour, could he?
No, he couldn't, but you could. Are they both at the same position? Or is one more advanced than the other?
Despite belting through the airport at a fierce clip with a throng of reporters running along beside him, Mr Peters' beeline for the exit came to an abrupt halt when it turned out his car was not waiting.
Do I have to get a regular taxi?
Taxi order.
Even though he had to stand and wait for his car to arrive, Winston Peters continued to avoid answering reporters' questions.
You've been using corporate cabs for years. Are you annoyed that they've botched your taxi order?
Unlike you, I'm a very tolerant, long-suffering man.
Winston Peters will be hoping the long-suffering public is equally tolerant as the waiting continues. Antu I te whare parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Chris Bramwalaho.
We head now to Somalia, where the death toll from the bomb blast that struck the heart of the country's capital, Mogadishu, is now in excess of 230 people. It's an understatement to describe this as willful attacks upon the innocent. Civilians were the target and civilians were the victims. Now, if you're listening, we're showing pictures posted on Twitter by a witness to the aftermath of one of the explosions. The destruction is so great that buildings and parts of buildings have completely disappeared. Large brick and concrete structures simply erased. People stand in the smoke looking at where loved ones lived or worked, and there's nothing left of those buildings. 3 days of national mourning have been declared, and health authorities are appealing for donations of blood and funds to help victims of these terrible attacks. This report from CNN's Farai Savenzo.
A massive truck bomb went off in the heart of Mogadishu's downtown K5 junction on Saturday, shortly after 3 p.m. Somali security forces say they had been tracking the vehicle when it exploded, killing more than 200 people as they went about their weekend. 10 minutes later, a second truck bomb exploded, but it was the force of the first blast that had the deadliest effect. People on buses, pedestrians, and many others at a nearby mall were killed. Buildings within the scope of the blast were completely destroyed, including the Safari Hotel, and the concern now is for the missing and whether the frantic rescue efforts will reach them on time. In the aftermath of the explosion, flames continue to burn as Mogadishu residents witness this latest devastation to their troubled city. The attack bore the hallmark of suicide bombings, which have been regular occurrences here since an Islamic insurgency began in Somalia a decade ago. As the day set on a tragic Saturday, it became apparent that this was the worst bomb blast to hit the Somali capital in its scale and loss of life.
What happened yesterday was incredible. I have never seen such a thing before, and the death toll is uncountable. Corpses were burned and no one could recognize them.
A new government led by President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo since elections back in February say they had been taking the fight to terrorism with the help of African Union troops and US drone strikes. The Somali president called for 3 days of national mourning as Somalis rushed to hospitals to donate blood for the injured. Mogadishu's hospitals are now full of critically injured people, many who have lost limbs and others who were badly burned. Terrorism in this East African country is far from over, with Somalia's capital, Mogadishu, still firmly on the front line.
That's Farai Savenzo from CNN. We'll be back in Mogadishu with the BBC's correspondent later in the programme. It's 5:16. You are with Checkpoint on RNZ. Let's head home again. In a little over a month, Auckland's Waterview tunnels earned the government nearly $1 million through speed camera fines. Figures given to Checkpoint under the Official Information Act show nearly 10,000 fines were issued in the camera's first 42 days. An average of more than 200 people caught speeding through the tunnels each and every day. The numbers came after we last talked at length about our road toll. 14 people died in just a 7-day period. And police say the number of fines being issued at Waterview's yet another example of the message not getting through. But is this revenue raising? Zach Fleming reports.
It's New Zealand's most expensive roading project, $1.4 billion. But the Waterview tunnels are also a cash cow, thanks to Aucklanders' need for speed. So far, they've been earning the government more than $23,000 a day.
If we have a crash halfway in that tunnel, it makes it very dangerous for everybody concerned, including the emergency responders. So we want people to understand that risk.
Police National Manager of Road Policing, Steve Greeley, says clearly not everyone does understand that risk. So the police operate 4 speed cameras in the twin 2.4 kilometre long tunnels, one at each entrance and exit. Figures given to Checkpoint under the Official Information Act show 9,756 fines, worth $948,000 were issued between July the 21st, when the cameras were turned on, and August the 31st. That's a total of 42 days. The police won't see a cent of that, though. The money goes into the general government tax pool.
We're at 299 deaths as of 6:30 this morning. I haven't had any more updates, so God forbid we've gone to 300, but the cameras are up there for a very good reason. They're in the areas of the highest risk, crash risk that is, for speed-related crashes, and they do their job.
Barney Irvine from the Automobile Association agrees.
No, it's certainly not revenue gathering. I mean, police aren't trying to trick anyone here. There's plenty of signage in every approach to the tunnel. But what this really highlights to us is the need for the speed camera sites to be reviewed every 6 to 12 months, not just in Waterview, but right around the country. And we think that review should be done by an independent body. That independent body would look at sites and decide what an appropriate infringement rate looks like, and on that basis decide whether too many tickets are being issued.
And despite the numerous media reports against the 80km/h speed limit around and inside the tunnels, saying too many tickets were being issued, there was nothing but support in Auckland CBD this afternoon.
If you're speeding, you're speeding. It's your own fault. Yeah, it's the time. If it says 80k, it's 80k.
He's probably one of them too.
It is what it is. The speed limit's there for a reason, isn't it?
What do you mean? Yeah, same. I agree. It's there for a reason.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. Pretty good? What do you mean?
Oh, I mean, like, that's what they're there for, right?
Amongst the figures given to Checkpoint, the police said just over 1.5 million vehicles drove through the tunnels in the 42 days between July 21st and August 31st, which, if true, would mean the number of people using the tunnels in their second month was half the first month. But the Transport Agency has disputed the police's figure. It says its records show more than 2.5 million trips in that period. The difference is, the police say, down to the fact its cameras aren't actually turned on 24 hours a day. They have to be turned off for maintenance, and so photos of people speeding can be downloaded. The Transport Agency says the speed limit inside the tunnels will stay at 80, and Superintendent Greeley says the speed cameras are here to stay.
To remove those would almost give open licence to some people, and I think the consequences then would be catastrophic.
Which means an easy $8 million a year for the government if Aucklanders continue to refuse to stick to the limit. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
And Zach was out with our cameraman and editor Bradley White. A seriously ill man has been evicted from his Tauranga home by the city's main social housing provider and is now living in emergency accommodation in a motel. Accessible Properties, a subsidiary of IHC, took over the ownership and management of more than 1,100 Housing New Zealand homes in Tauranga in March. Joe O'Brien reports.
Timothy Dalton Edwards says he requested Housing New Zealand test his home late last year as he suspected a boarder may have been smoking methamphetamine. Housing New Zealand says the test found the property had been contaminated and it had decided to rehouse him. But Mr Dalton Edwards says when Accessible Properties took over, they gave him notice and made it clear they would not find him another home.
I think I've been a bit kicked on the side, I think. Everything was actually getting done and there was no threats of me having to move out of the house. And when the house got turned over to the new owners, that's when everything just went downhill.
Tim's sister, Karen Dalton Edwards, says her 35-year-old brother suffered a traumatic head injury several years ago and is also on dialysis and trying to get healthy enough to undergo a kidney transplant. She says they've been living in emergency accommodation in a motel for the past month, which is affecting his health.
His health is really bad at the moment because he's stressed and he's not in a very good environment. He's worried every week that we're not going to be able, because we have to go and reapply for this unit every week and it doesn't look very good for us getting houses either.
Ms Dalton Edwards says Accessible Properties told Timothy they objected to the riffraff that was visiting his house. She believes more should have been done to help her brother.
Really disgusted in the way that the government's looking after him, really considering he's dying. I'm just watching my brother die with no quality of life.
Accessible Properties says it is unable to comment on specific cases, but in a statement from Tauranga manager Andrew Wilson it says,
"Where methamphetamine testing has established that a house is not safe for living in, or there's a high level of antisocial behaviour affecting others, we have a responsibility to ask people to leave the property. Since taking over the properties in Tauranga, we have substantially increased the amount of contact between tenancy managers and our tenants and are committed to supporting our tenants and their communities."
But that's not good enough for Michael Sharp from Tauranga's new housing advocacy service, who is supporting the Dalton Edwards. He says while allowing methamphetamine to be smoked would breach Timothy's lease, proper processes should have been followed prior to an eviction.
These are long-term social housing tenants, and they've dealt with Housing New Zealand for many years, and the practice dealing with Housing New Zealand is to allow them to try to rectify any faults or any issues they have with the way they look after the house. So they've gone from that sort of practice to this other approach of just Accessible Properties that seem to like people, just giving them the 90 days notice.
Michael Sharp says he is supporting another Accessible Properties tenant who has been given notice following a positive meth test on their property, even though the tenant says they know nothing about it. He says there's still a shortage of housing in Tauranga, with more than 150 families on the waiting list for social housing. The Salvation Army's Alan Johnson believes the sale of so many state houses in Tauranga to Accessible Properties has created a private monopoly which is not subject to scrutiny.
Housing New Zealand, I think because the public agency was subject to some scrutiny and some direction from, say, for example, ministers, whereas Accessible Properties is a law unto itself. It can get away with that, and what it means now is that people really don't have any right to housing, regardless of how serious their needs are, if Accessible Properties choose to ignore them.
In a statement, the Social Housing Minister Amy Adams says social housing providers like Accessible Properties have the same obligations as Housing New Zealand to ensure their properties are safe to live in. The Ministry of Social Development says it is concerned about Mr Dalton Edwards because he is very unwell. It says it's working with his caregiver to look at long-term housing options for him, which may include another Accessible Properties home or other social housing. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Joe O'Brien tēnei.
25 minutes past 5. Serious accusations against Hollywood movie producer Harvey Weinstein have spread across the Atlantic, with Scotland Yard investigating 4 allegations of sexual assault, including rape. British actress Lizette Anthony says she reported to police that Weinstein raped her in her West London home in the late 1980s. And police have released a statement saying they're looking at 3 allegations from another woman. The BBC's Daniel Sanford reports.
Being battered by a storm of sexual assault allegations in America, the clouds are gathering over Harvey Weinstein in the UK too. This was British actress Lisette Anthony in 1982, 19 years old and at the start of her career, filming the science fiction fantasy Cruel. That was when she met Harvey Weinstein, and in today's Sunday Times, she claims that a few years later, he raped her at her London home. She told the paper, "I kept my eyes shut tight. I remember lying in the bath later and crying." Harvey Weinstein, who's been lauded as a Hollywood A-lister for decades, has now conceded he made mistakes and needs help, but has categorically denied all allegations of non-consensual sex. The Metropolitan Police started investigating the allegations by Lisette Anthony last week. The force now says 2 more women have come forward. One claims Harvey Weinstein assaulted her in 1992, the other that he assaulted her 3 times in 2010, 2011 and 2015. But if detectives decide they do want to charge Harvey Weinstein, bringing him here wouldn't necessarily happen quickly. The courts in America would want to deal with all the cases there before extraditing him to Britain. Actress Alice Evans says she managed to avoid Harvey Weinstein's advances in Cannes in 2002 when he asked to feel her breasts, but she thinks it damaged her career.
It was very odd. The overtures were nothing to do with, wow, you're really pretty, or, I'm really enjoying talking. It was nothing to do with me. It was, I want to touch your. They say your blood runs cold up, but it's not really your blood. It's almost like your stomach turns.
Last night, the Academy of Motion Pictures, which hands out Oscars, expelled Harvey Weinstein. And today, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, said the film producer would lose his Légion d'honneur, one of France's highest decorations. But now he faces the real possibility of a criminal prosecution, either in America or in Britain.
That report from the BBC. The telecommunications company Vodafone is upgrading its television service to entice new customers. It's partnering with pay TV operator Sky as the companies look to work more closely together despite regulators turning down their proposed merger earlier this year. But one technology commentator has described the new offer as, and I quote, rather ho-hum. Maya Burry reports.
Vodafone is bringing in a new offering of free-to-air and pay television and internet video streaming services to be delivered by fibre and one set top box. Its chief executive, Russell Stanners, says the service and its technology will deliver a one-stop entertainment place, which is more convenient for the consumer, who won't have to muck around with different devices, apps and remotes.
So we've created what we believe is the premier user experience with the premier content from Sky, brought it together and are offering it to our customers as something that says this is Vodafone, this is what we deliver.
Mr Stanners says it will bundle broadband internet, Sky's pay TV channels, free-to-air channels and allow consumers to connect to streaming subscription services such as Netflix. Earlier this year, the Commerce Commission shot down the proposed merger between Vodafone and Sky because of the dominance the enlarged company would have in content such as live sport. Sky TV's chief executive, John Fallett, says the two companies are now closer than ever.
We spend a great deal of our time thinking about content, and more and more it's about the user experience. And it's not just any more about what do I want to watch, but where and when and what device I want to watch it on. And so we've been struggling with making that transition, and we'll continue to work on it. But the Vodafone opportunity from our vantage point allowed us to answer that question pretty quickly.
But the technology writer for Consumer New Zealand, Hayden Green, says being able to access all your content from one place is not new.
I mean, that's describing your telephone these days. They have, they're describing a box that you can get Sky through and Netflix through and YouTube through, TVNZ On Demand, TV3. Those are all like free programs. You can get a lot of those through your TV anyway.
Sky's profit fell sharply last year as it lost customers and programming costs rose, prompting investors to question the company's strategy to combat new rivals such as Netflix and Amazon. Mr Green says he does expect today's announcement may help boost Sky's subscriber numbers, but not significantly.
It'll get probably fewer people leaving the service if it's set up and just going through their TV on their internet connection, and people don't really have to think about it. You don't have a lot of impetus to move if everything's already set up on your TV, but Sky really has to completely change its business model in terms of broadcast television, at least, to really stop that.
Vodafone has yet to outline how much the new services will cost or when they will be available. For Checkpoint, Maya Burry.
You are with Checkpoint on RNZ. Thank you for being with us. Coming up on the program, should councils take on the job of culling stray cats? A lot of kittens born as the weather gets warmer. Why the tiny community of Pongaro is smiling about the smell of petrol fumes. Nona's here with Busy Day in Business. Lots to discuss tonight, but before all of that, Anna Thomas with the headlines.
Thanks, John. The New Zealand First Board and Caucus continue to meet behind closed doors at Parliament as they assess the policy concessions offered by Labour and National. Board members have flown into Wellington from around the country so the party chiefs can decide which party they want to form a government with. The Waikato District Health Board has apologised unreservedly to the family of an elderly man who died in July 2013. The Health and Disability Commissioner says the 78-year-old waited more than double the optimal time for hip replacement surgery. Anthony Hill says the DHB has acknowledged it could have cancelled elective surgery to fit him in. Nearly $1 million worth of speeding fines have been issued at Auckland's Waterview tunnels in a little over a month. The police operate 4 speed cameras at the twin tunnels, one at each entrance and exit. Figures given to Checkpoint under the Official Information Act show fines worth $948,000 were issued between July the 21st, when the cameras were turned on, and August the 31st. The owner of the land where the Marsden pipeline broke, disrupting jet fuel supplies and travel plans for thousands, is remaining elusive. Local authority records show Linton Hardley McMullen owns the lifestyle property where a digger is believed to have damaged the pipeline, but he's not answering calls from the Northland Regional Council. Authorities in the UK and Ireland have ordered all schools closed and warned cyclists and motorists to stay off the roads as Hurricane Ophelia nears the coastline with potentially deadly winds. Ireland's Weather Service has warned of violent and destructive gusts of wind along with heavy rain and storm surges as the storm crosses the country. And the head of Austria's Conservative People's Party, Sebastian Kurz, is on course to become the youngest national leader in the world after his victory in the country's general election. The 31-year-old, who is a former foreign minister, has pledged to transform his country and take a hard line on migration. And that's the news.
Yes, we're going to have more on Mr. Kurz coming up after business with Nona, who is seated on the other side of me in the studio. Vodafone-Sky, we're hearing about this a bit. Pushed ahead with their partnership despite their merger setback. What are they trying to do? And
well, they're generating a lot of excitement, that's for sure. I was at the launch of their of Vodafone's new Vodafone TV, and what it is really another kind of delivery of television and or entertainment services, whether it be online and what have you. It's one single platform, all in the cloud. And Vodafone is really thrilled, and they're going to be offering unlimited broadband, so whatever amount you want to eat, and with a basic Sky package. No idea how much it's going to cost yet or when it's actually going to be launched, but pretty exciting for Vodafone and Sky,
this goes back to the argument that Vodafone and Sky advanced right around their merger, so that Vodafone needs more content, Sky needs more customers.
You know what Vodafone's Russell Stanner said is that this is exactly what the Commerce Commission said they wanted when they pushed back on their merger. Innovation and collaboration, this is what they're doing. And they're saying, look, we're going ahead with our partnership outside of a merger situation. So instead of one company doing it together, 2 companies doing it together.
How did the market react today to all of this?
Actually, you know, well, Vodafone, we don't know what the share price would have done there, but because it's not listed. But in terms of the New Zealand situation, the Sky share price rose 2 cents to $2.89, which is not bad. I mean, it wasn't like wow, but look, we don't know how much it's going to add to their revenue stream, but it's going to bring in obviously more revenue because potentially more Sky customers in a different way. But, you know, interesting, John Follett, who runs Sky, said that he didn't think that would prompt other competitors, telecommunications companies, to come into the market and offer a competing service to a Vodafone television. He also thought that, interestingly, after the merger, nobody called him up and said, let's do business. So It didn't happen.
Yeah.
Never mind.
A lot of pressure on Sky, isn't there? Isn't it amazing how quickly, this is simplistic of me, but everyone who was over a certain age will remember when Sky arrived on the scene, and they were the big, new, extraordinary thing, pay TV. Already the model has a sense of being obsolete about it.
Yeah.
And so they have to find new ways to connect.
And that's what, and also NZME, they're in court today with their would-be partner, Fairfax, trying to appeal against a different merger setback from the Commerce Commission. In this case, they're also saying, look, the model has changed. We need to hurry. We need to work together. We need a decision or a reversal of the decision on the Commerce Commission that pushed back on their merger. Their share price is down more than 5%. That's actually 5 cents to 86 cents. So that the market didn't like that. But overall, believe it or not, we moved up to another record close, but just by 1 point. 1 point to 8,091. And look, it's a really interesting week. I'm sure we'll have a little bit more to say about this, but it's been 30 years since we had Black Monday, and that's when, the New Zealand share market, well, in our case, it was Black Tuesday because of the time difference.
Black Monday in the
but
US.
we lost, about 60% of the value of the share market, and I don't see that happening this week, so people can be calmed. We don't sort of see that. In fact, right around the world, markets are at their all-time high, Asia and, of course, Wall Street too. And, so back at home, I guess.
It's funny, I look back, because I'm old enough to remember this.
Yeah,
Are you old enough to remember it? I mean, so many of our properties...
What are we talking about?
That 87 crash. So many of our properties were houses built on sand. And I think, Equity Corp, Chase,
and also the type of share market investors were different then. I mean, we didn't have the Kiwi Saver, so there was a lot fewer institutional investors, that certainly not as many overseas investors. It was a bit more cowboy day, I think, A
little bit more.
A little bit more.
There were horses. No.
There were still horses.
What did the dollar do?
Actually, the dollar's a little bit stronger than it has been. Not exactly sure why. Could have been maybe the U.S. inflation data we talked about on Friday was weaker than expected. It's hard to know. The market is still waiting for a decision on our government. But anyways, it strengthened a little bit, 71.7 US cents, 91.1 Australian, and it was steady at 54 pence. And if there's anything else you want to talk about, John, we have all sorts of
Thanks very much, Nona. Actually, we do have more on the NZME Fairfax merger or non-merger coming up, courtesy of Eric Frickberg. Let's head now to Austria, where Sebastian Kurz, who leads the country's Conservative People's Party, does look set to become the world's youngest national leader after the country's general election. Aged 31, Mr Kurz is refusing to be drawn on whether he'll try to form a coalition with the far-right Freedom Party, an ardent critic of Austria's migration policies. The BBC's Bethany Bell reports from Vienna.
Für eine Politik von Sebastian Kurz.
There was a rapturous welcome for Sebastian Kurz after his victory. The 31-year-old, who's been called the Whiz Kid, has revitalised his tired Conservative Party with a promise of change.
Ich kann euch heute versprechen, ich werde mit voller Kraft und mit vollem
I promise you that with all my strength, I will fight for change in this country. And I would like to invite you to join us. We have a lot to do. We have to establish a new attitude, a new culture.
One of the main reasons for Mr Kurz's success was his tough line on illegal migration. That seems to have attracted votes away from the far-right Freedom Party, which has traditionally campaigned strongly against migrants, especially after the refugee crisis in 2015 and 16. But the far-right leader Heinz-Christian Strache said the real victory was for Freedom Party policies.
Das war heute ein Auftrag, wenn fast 60%.
Today was a mandate when 60% of the Austrian population voted for the Freedom Party programme, my dear friends. It shows we have been right all these years as the trendsetters, and we'll stick to our word.
Liebe Freunde.
Austria has moved to the right, but the shape of the next government isn't clear yet. Mr Kurz says he's leaving his options open when it comes to a coalition partner. The last coalition between the Social Democrats and the Conservatives fell apart this spring, and many believe Mr Kurz will try to form an alliance with the Freedom Party.
That's the BBC's Bethany Bell reporting from Vienna, of course. The investigation into the rupture of the Marsden pipeline has stalled simply because the regional council can't get in touch with the landowner where the pipe burst. It does seem quite an extraordinary state of affairs. A month after the pipe broke, disrupting jet fuel supplies and travel plans for thousands, the council's investigation is effectively stymied in this fashion. For weeks, the Northern Regional Council has been trying to get in touch with the owner of the Kirkuk lifestyle block, where it's believed a digger damaged the pipe. The council won't confirm the owner's identity, but District Council records showed the owner is Linton Hardley McMullen. The council's regulatory manager, Colin Dall, told our Northern reporter, Lois Williams, they're simply trying to establish who contributed to the pipeline rupturing.
So we've certainly contacted him and left a message on his voicemail. It appears that he isn't picking up his phone at this point of time. We will also be writing to him as well. At this stage, we're just gathering some further information before we do that.
Do you know if he's still in New Zealand or has he left the country?
That I can't answer at this stage. As far as we're aware, he's still in the country.
So what authority, what power have you got to actually make him come and talk to you about this?
Well, we don't have the same powers of the police. We can certainly invite people in to talk to us, but we can't compel them to do that.
So this guy who may or may not have broken the pipeline, and we don't know if it was him at this point, and caused huge disruption to so many travellers and an enormous amount of expense and inconvenience for people and the refinery, cannot be compelled to come and account for himself.
Not in terms of our investigation, which is under the Resource Management Act.
Who would have that power? Anyone?
It's a good question, and I can't answer that.
Right, so what happens next?
Again, we will be continuing to gather information. We've been discussing or talking to a range of parties, including neighbours.
Colin Dall from the Northern Regional Council talking to Lois, of course, our Northern reporter. Let's return to something Nona was talking about in brief during our business conversation. Two of the country's media giants and a battery of lawyers turning up at a Wellington's High Court today to contest a Commerce Commission ban on their merger. If approved, the type between NZME and Stuff, formerly called Fairfax, would create a giant media company comprising the New Zealand Herald, the Don Post, the Press, half the country's commercial radio markets, including Newstalk ZB and many other provincial and weekly newspapers. Now, the Commerce Commission knocked back the merger because it would centralise too much media power. But as Eric Frickberg reports, the companies argue they need to combine to survive and have challenged the Commission's veto.
This was a high-powered court case with 5 lawyers on each side, and even a professor of economics from Australia seated alongside the judge, ready to provide technical advice. The company's lead lawyer, David Goddard QC, wasted no time in getting started, saying established media was under attack from the internet and had to move fast to counter that threat.
The appellants do not have the luxury of waiting until there is a crisis and then responding. They need to address it now. A pole vaulter has a much better chance of clearing the bar if they take a run-up rather than standing beneath it and attempting to leap.
In banning the merger proposal last May, the Commission said the outcome would be an unprecedented concentration of newspapers in New Zealand, risking harm to democracy and to the New Zealand public. But Mr Goddard told the court there were many sources of news besides the merged venture, and he cited RNZ and TVNZ to prove that there would still be many voices in the media. The Commission, he said, made its decision on a snapshot taken at the time of the application, when what was needed was a moving picture of a fast-changing industry. And he produced a colourful image to show just how the internet is undermining traditional media.
I don't often find myself quoting President Trump, but he said recently that having a Twitter feed was like owning the New York Times, but without the losses.
Mr Goddard said Google and Facebook were claiming the lion's share of online advertising. He said this caused strains on the quality of existing media because bills and wages in the industry still had to be paid, but advertising money fell short. Nor, he said, were readers flocking to newspapers.
As a result of the move online, print is no longer the main source which consumers turn to for news and information. In any given week, 54% of consumers' news content is sourced from online sources, 21% from TV, and 13% from traditional newspapers.
Despite that, Mr Goddard said it was still possible to attract advertisers to newspapers if the content of those papers made people want to read them, but that required steps to make sure the financial model for papers was workable. He said the proposed merger would help achieve that, citing the value of commercial gains from the deal at between $40 million and $200 million. Finally, Mr Goddard scotched any idea that a merged company would make people pay if they want to read its content.
There is absolutely no support in the evidence for the likelihood of a NZ Herald-wide paywall because the cost of doing that in terms of foregone reader attention was too great.
Mr Goddard's submissions are expected to be followed by counter-submissions from the Commerce Commission's lawyer, Jim Farmer QC, later this week. For Checkpoint, Eric Frickberg.
The death toll from the wildfires that have left large black scars across big parts of Northern California stands at 40. Among the thousands of homes and buildings destroyed by the fires are a number of wineries. The Napa region is famous for them, of course. Goose Cross is not one of them, but the flames came very close. And their winemaker, an expat New Zealander named Bill Nancaro, whose clients have included President Obama and music and movie stars, says it's been dreadful to watch near neighbours simply burnt from the face of the earth.
It's surreal. It's absolutely surreal. So I live in St Helena, which is kind of the northern part of Napa Valley, and St Helena has been spared, thankfully. There's a few fires, actually, you just see them now flaring up just in the western mountains, but there's about 12 helicopters dumping water on them at the moment. But I was actually at work at the winery at 10:30 at night, because we're in the middle of harvest, and walked out, and I just saw this ridge line to the southeast, southeast, a light, and I was like, damn, that's a big fire, and it was really windy, so I ran down, drove down to a friend's place because I knew he lived down there. I just wanted to make sure he was awake and aware of what was going on, and ended up staying there for a few hours, and a whole group of us helped him save his property, basically, from the fire. So I got pretty close to it. That was on Sunday night. And then woke up Monday and just saw the utter devastation, not just from that fire, but what was even worse, in the Tubbs Lane fire, which devastated Santa Rosa. I mean, just went through suburbs and incinerated, houses after houses. It was just unbelievable. So I've got friends over there who've lost everything. If I look to the due east, about a quarter of a mile away, where the mountainside is, it is black.
A quarter of a mile?
There's a house that they solved. Yep. Yeah. I'll send Bridget a photo.
Gosh, it is so. We'd love that.
Black.
Thank you. We'll overlay it. So, in fact, by the time this goes here, we will have done that. So, thank you. But it's that close. Yeah. And then, of course, it's spread over a gigantic distance. I think twice the size of the Abel Tasman National Park is the total distance that the fires have now destroyed.
So, what they call the big fire, because, I think we got up to 15 individual fires all at the same time. The Atlas Peak fire, that headed east, and that's just that's a lot of scrubland, mountainous region. There are properties and the likes, and then it got close to Lake Berryessa, and there's a few little settlements out there, so they were evacuated. There's a lot of vacant, mountainous, hilly land that got torched, and the thing was, we had a record wet winter. And then a very dry, hot summer. And so there was a lot of vegetative growth up in those hillsides from the winter that dried out. So there was just so much material ready and waiting to burn,
Yeah. And in the context of the fact that this started at night, so lots of people had already gone to bed by the time the sort of official notifications were beginning to take place. And in the context of...
fast moving.
And fast
really
moving.
The winds, the winds were, 30 to 50 miles an hour, occasional gusts, above that. The suburbs over in Santa Rosa that got torched, I mean, those people, they just ran out of the house. I mean, I don't think they had any notification of the fact that the place was on fire. And I don't want to sound dramatic, but I mean, I imagine that's how it was. And it was just so fast moving that it was hard for people to react to.
In that context, the death toll of 40, which is appalling, just absolutely tragic and devastating, is also at some level maybe not as high as it might have been, because it was late. The flames were moving so fast and people simply didn't know there were fires upon them, did they?
Yeah. And John, I'm the occasional report that I see, there's still people missing, unaccounted for. So I would imagine that count's going to go up. And unfortunately, there's a lot of elderly people apparently, and the number that have been found that have passed away. And it's just unbelievable. It is surreal. You just stand here, like I'm standing in the middle of the middle of the valley, and a couple of days ago, when there was a little bit more fire activity, you just looked around and there were fires, just fires on the ridges, and you just sat here and watched, and planes came in and helicopters came in, and dumping water on it, and then there's the firefighters, the first responders. Those guys are incredible heroes. They're just there, keeping the fires at bay as best they can.
It's Bill Nankaro, who is a Kiwi but now a winemaker in the Napa Valley. Conservationists want local councils to take on the job of culling stray cats, saying the SPCA's policy of trying to find homes for the rising number of abandoned animals is not helping high-risk native wildlife. Unlike stray dogs, when they can't be rehomed, most abandoned cats are not put down. But, as Nita Blake-Person reports, some conservationists do want that changed.
Dozens of abandoned cats come to Auckland's SPCA every week, but that will soon surge to 100 a day as the weather warms up. Jess Beer is the part-time head vet at the organisation's Auckland branch. She says at the peak of the kitten season, the SPCA and its foster volunteers care for up to 600 cats at a time.
We have large populations of pets that aren't being cared for, and the reality is most of these stray cats have been abandoned at some point in their life. They've had to scavenge, they've had to find food wherever they can, maybe that's garbage bags or the lovely lady down the street who leaves them food. And without desexing and having a home to look after them, they do resort to becoming pests.
The cats that rely on the care of the SPCA are not euthanased, despite the risk they pose to native wildlife.
We do have a policy, we do not euthanize healthy adoptable animals, so it's very easy and clear for us to state that.
Forest and Bird Chief Conservation Advisor Kevin Hackwell says that policy is bad news for native wildlife, as cats are the biggest killers in urban areas.
If the SPCA don't want to have that responsibility, which they do, they have, then maybe we should be taking it on. The council should take it on. The councils manage stray dogs, but not stray cats. That's the SPCA. Maybe the SPCA should give up that role and let the councils look after the stray cats if that's, where they'd rather be.
Mr Hackwell says in Australia, stray cats are picked up by the council, and if they don't have a microchip or an owner, they're put down. Jessie Morgan, daughter of notorious anti-cat campaigner Gareth Morgan and spokesperson for the Predator Free New Zealand Trust, says getting councils to take on more responsibility for controlling the cat population is a good move. She says cats have free rein to wander in New Zealand, and councils would be in a better position than the SPCA to euthanase any animals that don't have homes or can't be adopted.
They're funded by the cat ladies, right? So they don't want to tell the cat ladies that they're euthanasing them. Euthanasing all the cats. So they have to be really careful. They've got funders they're trying to keep happy as well. And I think if we can remove some of that emotion by getting the councils involved, then that sounds like a promising solution.
New Zealand has some of the highest rates of cat ownership in the world. In July, a controversial remit was passed at Local Government New Zealand's annual meeting, calling on the government to give councils extra powers to protect wildlife from cats, including microchipping, desexing and registration. Local Government New Zealand President Dave Cull says councils have some powers to control cats if they are a health risk to people, but have very little power to protect wildlife.
We have some of the rarest wildlife in the world. A good proportion of our bird life is under threat, and yet we seem to be hesitant to control one of its most dangerous predators, which is an introduced animal.
Mr Cull says given the SPCA is a society set up to protect animals, councils are in a much better position to put down cats if necessary. He says the result of Local Government New Zealand's proposal will be determined by the incoming government. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Nita Blake Persona Ho.
Let's head to the tiny Tararua settlement of Pongaroa, which woke up this morning to the smell of petrol fumes, and its residents couldn't be happier about that. After 4 years without a gas station, fuel pumps are again operating, all thanks to a never say die community spirit. Our reporter Robin Martin has more.
Fed up with a 2-hour commute to either Pahiatua or Dannevirke to get gas, locals decided about 2 years ago to do something about it. Fast forward to today, and the community has raised $250,000 and formed a unique partnership with Allied Petroleum to open a fuel stop outlet in the village. A member of the Pongaroa Fuel Stop Committee, Mark Wheeler, says many of the village's 120 residents had endured an arduous fuel run more than once a week.
If you're working on a number of properties through the week, you might have to make that drive twice to do it. And of course, by the time you get back, you've used about a quarter of the fuel that you've actually put in the damn thing. So people used to go to town with, jerry cans stacked all over the back seat.
Mr Wheeler says they wrangled money out of the Tararua District Council, got donations and took out a loan with Allied to get the project off the ground. He says residents also got stuck in and got their hands dirty doing the groundwork at the site.
When we said, we've got the contractors here, we could do it ourselves, they probably thought we'd turn up with a couple of old two-wheel drive David Brown tractors and a backhoe. And they've actually complimented us when we finished what we did. It said, you couldn't have got it done better by a civil contractor.
The administrator at the Pongaroa School, Phelan Hoggard, says she won't miss the fuel run.
Somebody like myself would be taking 3 20-litre containers in the back of the car, on a weekly or fortnightly basis, plus fill the car up. So you plan it. You've got to plan. If you're going for groceries, well, it's all part of the experience.
Ms Hoggard says travellers will also benefit from the new pumps.
So people do happily wander along Route 52 and suddenly find themselves in Pongaroa and there is no petrol station. So everybody's had to sort of rally around and point them in a right direction to see if they can fill a can to get them to maybe Dannevirke or Marsden or Pahiatua, wherever the nearest petrol stop would be.
The General Manager of Allied Petroleum, Alistair Tennant, admits to being initially sceptical about the financial viability of a Pongaroa fuel stop, but he says the locals have shared the risk and forced his hand.
I would say it's been a real vision and tenacity by a local committee that's really got them to where they got to today. Anyone who had a digger or something in the district, I'm sure, was called in to generously donate their time and their equipment. So it was a tremendous effort by the locals.
Mr Tennant says Allied put up about $1 million and he sees potential for similar deals elsewhere.
I do have a suspicion that this won't be the last opportunity we have to do something like this. I think they won't be alone in terms of small towns around New Zealand where people realise that having a public fuel supply in a little town is pretty important.
For an exhausted but exhilarated Mr Wheeler, the fuel stop, which opened on Saturday, has taken on almost a spiritual quality.
That evening after it got dark, we actually went out, and you can see it from the hotel. That's about 400 yards down the road. And the sign was illuminated, the site was illuminated, and we said to one another, there's no Christmas lights display or fireworks display anywhere that could look better than that now.
The unmanned fuel stop will operate 24/7, 7 days a week at the crossroads of Route 52, Post Road and the Pahiatua Pongaroa Road. For Checkpoint, ko Robin Martin tēnei.
Lots of feedback coming in. Thank you all. The Ruakaka pipe and the fact that no one's managed to speak to the landowner where the pipe was damaged. Martin says, bloody hell, so many laws and regulations, so many holes in laws and regulations. Other countries would think New Zealand has lost its marbles, and I'm certain I feel the same way. sometimes.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good evening, I'm Anna Thomas. The Waikato District Health Board has apologised unreservedly to the family of an elderly man who died in July 2013. The Health and Disability Commissioner says the 78-year-old waited more than double the optimal time for hip replacement surgery. Anthony Hill says the DHB has acknowledged it could have cancelled elective surgery to fit him in. He died 2 weeks after being admitted. The Executive Director for Waikato Hospital Services, Brett Paradine, says the board's made major improvements since then.
In September 2013, we increased from 3 to 4 dedicated orthopaedic theatres, and we increased capacity again in 2016, and we put in place more surgeons and more specialist orthopaedic nurses. We are doing a lot better in regard to the timeliness of acute surgery, and it's an area we continue to work on.
The DHB's Brett Paradine. The Ministry of Social Development is looking at long-term housing options for a seriously ill man who's been evicted by Tauranga's main social housing provider. Accessible Properties, a subsidiary of IHC, bought more than 1,100 Housing New Zealand homes there in March. A Salvation Army policy analyst says Accessible Properties is a law unto itself. Joe O'Brien reports.
Timothy Dalton-Edwards, who is on dialysis, says when Accessible Properties took over his house, it gave him notice and would not find him another home. He says that's despite his assurance meth contamination detected in his home had been caused by a boarder. Accessible Properties says it has a responsibility to ask people to leave where testing has established the house is not safe. But the analyst Alan Johnson says it shows the private provider is not subject to the same scrutiny as Housing New Zealand. The Social Housing Minister says all social housing providers are obliged to ensure their properties are safe. Ko Joe O'Brien tēnei.
Nearly $1 million worth of speeding fines have been issued at Auckland's Waterview tunnels in a little over a month. The police say the 4 cameras in the tunnel caught nearly 10,000 people going above the 80-kilometre speed limit, which is 6 out of every 1,000 drivers. The National Road Policing Manager, Superintendent Steve Greeley, says the figures reiterate the need to drive to the conditions and that people are simply driving too fast. He says the police are not interested in revenue gained from the infringements, only informing people they need to slow down and drive to the speed limit.
We're at 299 deaths as of 6:30 this morning. I haven't had any more updates, so God forbid we've gone to 300. But the cameras are up there for a very good reason. They're in the areas of the highest risk, crash risk that is, for speed-related crashes, and they do their job.
Steve Greeley says international evidence shows speed cameras do have an impact on slowing people down. New Zealand First's caucus and board are still locked in a meeting at Parliament as they continue to weigh up the policy concessions offered by Labour and National. Board members have gathered in Wellington as the party decides which party to form a government with. All the party leaders and Winston Peters will say that the announcement will be made before the end of the week. The owner of the land where the Marsden pipeline broke, disrupting jet fuel supplies and travel plans for thousands, is remaining elusive. Council records show Linton Hardley McMullen owns the lifestyle property where the digger is believed to have damaged the pipeline. The Northland Regional Council has been calling Mr McMullen, but he's not picking up the phone. The regulatory manager, Colin Dahl, says staff have left a message on Mr McMullen's voicemail and will also write to him.
Ultimately, we're looking at what parties potentially contributed to the escape of contaminants, basically the jet fuel. That's the unauthorised discharge under the RMA. In that regard, what was his role in potentially allowing that escape?
Colin Dahl from the Northland Regional Council. Conservationists want local councils to take on the job of culling stray cats, saying the SPCA's policy of trying to find homes for them is not helping high-risk native wildlife. Unlike stray dogs that can't be rehomed, most abandoned cats are not put down, and are cared for by the SPCA until they're adopted. Forest and Birds Chief Conservation Advisor Kevin Hackwell says that policy is bad news for native wildlife, as cats are their biggest killers in urban areas. Mr Hackwell says he supports the SPCA's ethos to prevent cruelty to animals, but if it is unable or unwilling to euthanise cats to control the population, councils should do the job. It's 6:05. To sport now. In Canterbury, first five Richie Maunga has been called into the All Blacks squad as temporary cover for Beauden Barrett for this weekend's test against Australia in Brisbane. Barrett's still suffering symptoms from the head knock he sustained against South Africa last weekend. Meanwhile, defeating the All Blacks would cap a revival of sorts for the Wallabies, according to Australian playmaker Bernard Foley. Fresh off their draw in South Africa, the win in Argentina and narrow loss to the All Blacks in Dunedin, Foley says while they're happy with their form reversal since August's record loss to the All Blacks, only a win would satisfy him this weekend. Kiwi Soccer Thomas Luluai says he'd be happily welcomed defector Jason Taumalolo back into the New Zealand team in the future. Taumalolo returned his back on New Zealand just a day before their Rugby League World Cup squad was announced, deciding instead to play for Tonga. Luluai told reporters at today's World Cup jersey launch that he was initially shocked by Taumalolo's decision, but because it's within the rules, he has no issue with it.
At the end of the day, he's half Tonga and half New Zealand, so who are we to say he doesn't want to represent his country and his parents and that, and so I've got no problems with it.
Thomas Luluai. And ambitious plans have been unveiled for a New York Rugby League team to follow Toronto into the English game. A business plan has been submitted to the Rugby Football League and organisers, who say they have the backing of wealthy benefactors and hope to get the go-ahead in time to enter the competition in 2019. And that's the news.
This week on Nights From Here to Eternity, a chat with the author Caitlin Doherty on funeral rites from around the world. She's written a book about them. Our physicist Sean Hendy brings the science. James Brown looks at examples of poems set to music. He has his doubts about it. I might have won him over. And speaking of music, Bush Gothic are in the studio direct from the airport with their own dark brand of Aussie folk. On Nights this week with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
And now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Manawatu, including Coromandel Peninsula and the Central High Country, along with the Bay of Plenty. A mix of sun and clouds with isolated afternoon and evening showers. Gisborne to Wairarapa, also Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast and Wellington. Fine spells, isolated showers spreading north, clearing for a time tomorrow morning and afternoon. Nelson and Marlborough, excluding the Kaikoura Coast. Isolated showers clearing, them mainly fine. For the Kaikoura Coast and Canterbury, cloudy with isolated showers becoming fine tomorrow morning, but a few showers developing from the afternoon. Otago and Southland, mainly fine, but showers everywhere tomorrow morning, but they will clear in Southern Lakes, Central Otago and North Otago in the afternoon. Bulla to Fiordland, mainly fine, but a few showers for you too tomorrow. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a few showers. RNZ National, it's 6:08 and you're listening to John Campbell on Checkpoint.
Thank you very much. And Anna Thomas as well. Thank you very much, Anna Thomas. If you are travelling north over the Harbour Bridge in Auckland tonight and you're thinking that it is bad even by Auckland standards, you are right. There is a bus broken down on the Harbour Bridge, blocking lane 2. Expect delays from Wellington Street. We understand there is a real backup. A bus is broken down. They're trying to get it off the bridge as we speak. Talking about waiting and waiting and waiting. Let's go to Wellington. New Zealand First MPs and board members have been locked in a day-long meeting as they consider proposals to form a government from both National and Labour. While face-to-face coalition talks wrapped up last week, there have yet to be discussions about ministerial positions and governing arrangements. On arriving at Wellington Airport this morning, New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters would not say whether the board would make a final decision today. Our political reporter Sarah Robson joins us from our gallery office. Hi Sarah, what is the latest?
Hi John, yes, the New Zealand First Board and Caucus is still locked in that meeting in the New Zealand First Caucus room over in Bowen House. They haven't emerged at all today. We know that lunch was actually taken up to them, and at about 4:30 this afternoon we had an emailed statement from New Zealand First saying that the discussions were continuing and that that meeting was expected to last several hours yet. We know that the Board and Caucus are considering those two different proposals from National and Labour, and we're possibly in for a long wait. Winston Peters had indicated late last week that the board members would be booked in overnight in Wellington tonight in case they did run over a few more hours yet.
Yeah. Really interesting to hear Bill English talking about this morning. He was doing the media rounds. I heard him on Morning Report, but he was talking to people, really making the first public statements in a wee while about where things were at.
That's right. Mr. English said that there were still some unresolved issues and that further talks were needed. So New Zealand First hasn't yet discussed with National issues around ministerial positions or how a governing arrangement, what that might look like. And we do know that Labour is in the exact same position. So Winston Peters has been very even-handed in how he's been managing those negotiations. Over the weekend, we do know that New Zealand First has been in contact with both National and Labour, clarifying some issues around policy. But as you mentioned earlier, last week's talks all focused entirely on policy. Those several days worth of meetings with National and Labour haven't yet dealt with those issues around ministerial positions or what exactly a government with New Zealand First might look like.
Yes, the issue, of course, is collective responsibility, isn't it? Inside or outside of Cabinet. What now from here, Sarah?
Well, reporters at Parliament will be waiting as long as it takes for that meeting to finish tonight. We're not sure when that might happen. And as you mentioned earlier, we're not sure if we will actually have a decision at the end of that meeting. We don't know when any decision from this meeting will be made public. Winston Peters said late last week that that's actually going to depend on which way that decision falls. We do know that National and Labour, both parties, have their officials on standby, ready to meet at a moment's notice in case the decision falls their way, to ratify that and wrap that all up from their end. But Winston Peters has indicated that the New Zealand public will know by the end of this week who will lead the next government.
Thank you so much, Sarah Robson. Benedict Collins has just tweeted that they're going to resume their discussions tomorrow morning. The New Zealand First Board is going to resume their discussions tomorrow morning. So that picks up on what Sarah was just saying about the fact that it does seem as this is very much an ongoing process. They're resuming at 9 a.m. Benedict Collins, who is one of Sarah's colleagues in the gallery. Sarah joining us from the gallery office. Well, as the country waits, as National, Labour and the Greens wait, and as some commentators reach spontaneous combustion levels of exasperation, a three-term New Zealand First MP who missed out on getting back this election by 2 list places has a pretty good idea of what will be going on. Peter Paraone, first elected on the New Zealand First list in 2002, believes that whilst National did indeed win 56 seats to Labour's 46, it's the 55% of voters who didn't vote National who've sent the most meaningful message to New Zealand First.
Not only were they telling New Zealand First, but they were telling all political parties that there was a desire for change. And that's notwithstanding that one party got a majority of the electoral seats. But if you consider the way people voted, irrespective of which party, those who voted against the status quo far exceeded those whose by virtue of their own voting supported the status quo. So in my mind, there seemed to be a desire for change in government.
So what impact will that sense have on New Zealand First's considerations about which way they should go?
Oh, I think it will certainly have some impact in terms of their consideration, but not only that, they will also consider the future of the party come 2020. And so all of that will be part of the mix that the present caucus will and the board members would need to consider.
And would it be your expectation that the future of the party come 2020, which is the next election, obviously, would be a future post-Winston Peters himself?
I wouldn't say that, because with my experience with him, there's a lot of energy there, and his intellect is still sharp as ever. So I wouldn't write him off, but I'm sure that he will be considering leaving the party with a strong foundation going into the future.
And a sense of momentum. And your concern, I suspect, is that it's going to be easier to do that after one term of a Labour government, Labour-led government, than after 4 terms of a national-led government.
That is certainly my belief. But at the end of the day, the caucus and the board will make their decision on the evidence that they've been presented with.
You were number 11 on the list, so you missed out by 2 places. If you had been there, if you had been sitting there today with the board and the caucus, and you'd gone round the table, which way would you have voted to go?
Well, I would have certainly reminded people of the obvious wins for change, and I would certainly remind us of our long-term future. But at the end of the day, I would also consider how many of our policies were similar or got support from the other 2 parties. And I think that will also be a consideration that the board and the parliamentary caucus will have to consider.
Peter Paraone talking to us earlier this afternoon. So here's a 3-term New Zealand First MP, number 11 on the list. Of course, they got 9 MPs in. And we are now just able to confirm that it looks like negotiations, discussions, contemplations will begin tomorrow morning recommence tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The New Zealand First Board and caucus trying to work out what their response is to the offers, the concessions, the accommodations they have received from National and Labour, and discuss whether or not they want to be part of a formal coalition inside Cabinet with collective Cabinet responsibility, which means you're weighed down by having to agree with your senior coalition partner or sit outside Cabinet. All of those discussions will resume tomorrow morning. Feedback tonight on lots of things, particularly the story about the man in Tauranga, the seriously ill man in Tauranga who was evicted from social housing. Andrew says they've achieved exactly what they wanted in selling state houses. No responsibility for messing up on their duty of care. Housing New Zealand itself was bad enough. They sped up the death of my brother, Andrew said, who was forced to live in a very substandard accommodation because they wouldn't build a wheelchair ramp so he could access the home he needed. I've only got a satisfaction, fingers crossed, for social housing because I went to my MP. MSD was impossible to deal with otherwise, despite very obvious and pronounced need. And D, a texter says, how utterly immoral that all those state houses were sold off in Tauranga to a private buyer. How could the national government do that? Are there no ethical New Zealanders left? Thank you for your feedback. Quite a few people suggesting that the same rules should apply to stray cats that can't be rehoused and as applied to stray dogs in many situations, and that is that they are euthanized. Quite a few people saying that. Normally we get a big push in support of cats. Not tonight. Farmers on the Banks Peninsula near Christchurch are counting the cost of a proposed bylaw that would regulate the movement of stock on some roads. Cows and sheep have been a common sight walking in mobs down the district's roads for years, as it's an easy way for farmers to move them from one land parcel to another. But Christchurch City Council is looking at tightening the rules to increase the safety of road users, although some farmers say more regulation would be impractical and is just not needed. Logan Church reports on this for us.
Tim Coop's family has been farming on the Banks Peninsula for over a century. He has about 6,000 sheep and several hundred cows. but says the tighter rules would make it more complicated to move them on some neighbouring public roads.
For us, it would mean a lot of extra costs with pilot vehicles and on very low volume, low speed roads, which would be unnecessary. So we would have to employ someone to go in front of various mobs of sheep, and we would have to start thinking about when we shifted them, and yeah, it would certainly have a financial impact, and it would mean we just couldn't do things when we needed to in terms of animal welfare and that sort of thing.
5 farmers, including a local community board member and a representative from Federated Farmers, attended today's hearings panel meeting, all raising concerns about the plan. The panel is considering whether the current bylaw should be replaced with a new one that would require farmers to get written permission before stock could be moved onto restricted roads across the district. There are more than 90 restricted roads which have been identified as having a higher risk and include known tourist routes or roads with higher speeds or traffic volumes. Ewan Kelsall from Federated Farmers says it wouldn't be practical to have to apply for consents before moving stock.
The impracticality of applying and writing to move stock along or down the road for things that you can't always plan in advance. Weather-related things can be quite fickle. Many activities on the farm, require fine weather, shearing, tailing. It can be hard to know when and where you need to move stock.
There were 18 submissions on the proposed changes. 2 supported it, 8 supported it but had some concerns, 4 had some concerns, and 4 did not support it. Submitters were not only concerned about the danger of stock on the road, but were also worried about cow manure, which they said made the road slippery and led to the degradation of the road surface. Ruth and Mike Williams own a farm near Little Akaroa and say if the council wants to increase road safety, there are more pressing issues to fix.
The gutter, which was put in quite a few years ago and was a huge improvement to Little Akaroa Road, it has been chronically full of debris of plants and branches and so forth, and that has had a huge influence on where rain has gone, in a very high rainfall winter, and the damage to the road through scouring and underrunners starting to develop. And I think that's far more of a safety issue than actually the stock movement.
Tim Coop says he regularly moves his stock across roads, but has never had an incident.
No, look, we haven't, and it's because we're on, as I said, low volume roads, and they're at low speed, and when people are in our environment on Banksmanshire, they actually expect to meet stock because it's an area where there is a lot of stock and they can see them as they're driving around, no, we don't have incidents.
However, cyclist Ian Murray says he's had potentially dangerous encounters with cows on the roads and told the meeting today that something needed to be done.
A couple of times I've come round corners straight into cows just all over the road. For me, that's pretty risky. A combination of road rash and cow poo, I think, would be a real health hazard. And not just for me, there are many cyclists who use that road.
The hearings panel will make recommendations on the proposed bylaw at a meeting on Thursday. The final decision is up to the City Council. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Logan Church.
We're going to go to a developing story in northern Iraq now. Iraqi forces have clashed with Kurdish forces as Iraq continues its advance towards Kurdish-held sites near the city of Kirkuk, heightening tensions between the two sides over the future of Iraqi Kurdistan. The Iraqi army was deployed following the Kurdish independence referendum last month, after which Kurdish leaders declared they had a mandate to discuss independence with Baghdad. Real tension developing here. Here's the BBC's Orla Guerin.
Facing a new threat and perhaps a new battleground. The Kurdish Peshmerga, ringed by the mountains and now by the Iraqi military. Former allies turned foes over the fate of Kirkuk. This veteran Kurdish commander told me they have drawn a line in the sand and if they must, will wage war.
We don't like war, we are peacefully we like to find this peaceful solution for the problems, but if they try to cross us, we will answer them.
You are ready for a shooting war if needs be?
Yeah, sure, 100%, yes.
For now, they wait, poised in case the war of words turns into something worse. The Iraqi military wants this frontline position. The Kurds say they won't give it up. In fact, they've been bringing reinforcements. They tell us they now have IS fighters on one side and Iraqi forces on the other. They feel like they have two enemies to deal with. The international community is looking on with concern. Few would want another war front in Iraq. The oil fields nearby would be part of the spoils, along with the disputed city in Kurdish hands since 2014. That's when Iraqi forces fled as IS advanced. The Kurds here say they will defend the city to the death. While we are still breathing, no one can come here, says Mohammed Sadek. They will have to kill us first. Me, my family and my whole household will stand in front of them. Baghdad has been sending the big guns. So far, the tanks have remained outside the city. Iraq's Prime Minister says he won't fire on his fellow citizens, the Kurds, but he seems determined to reclaim territory. And Kirkuk is now a powder keg.
Orla Guerin with that report. Brendan Hartley will become just the 9th New Zealander to race in the Formula One when he drives for Italian syndicate Toro Rosso at Texas this weekend. The 27-year-old wasn't even alive the last time a New Zealander, Mike Thackwell, raced in Formula One. That was '84. Hartley's been called in as a replacement driver just for this race, but is hoping it will lead to bigger things. The Palmerston North man is no stranger to the motorsport world. He won at Le Mans with fellow New Zealander Earl Bamber earlier this year, but his father, Brian Hartley, told our reporter Matt Chatterton he always had faith his son would make it to the very top echelon of motorsport.
He has got the X factor where he can read races, read conditions, give you the right feedback, and a very determined little driver. He has a lot of special attributes about it. Yeah.
Do you know what he can expect going into Texas?
Well, yeah, he knows what to expect because he's been involved. He's been test driver and all that sort of thing for him. So he's pretty much aware of what the procedure is, and with what he's doing at the moment, it's probably not a lot different.
I know you said you had a brief conversation with him. Did he say whether or not he had any expectations for the event?
Well, the expectations is to do well. It's going to be very hard for him because he's done no testing or simulator testing. So he's probably going in there more unprepared than anyone else ever has.
Did you give him any advice when you spoke to him? Did he need any advice?
He doesn't need any advice, no. He's fully aware of what he's got to do. He uses his head and all that sort of thing. He knows what to do. Yeah.
Brendan Hartley's very proud dad, Brian, talking to Matt Chatterton. Let's end tonight in Invercargill, where a group of playful library employees have paid homage to the Kardashians' 10th anniversary in their own unique way. The recreation of a photo shoot of arguably the most famous reality TV family has gone globally viral, and with good reason. It's magnificent. Timothy Brown reports.
I'm already having this anxiety attack over security, and I'm already just like on high alert. And now paparazzi's found us. It's like just the scrutiny that we get all the time. We try to avoid.
Paparazzi, private vacations, and life among the glitz and glamour of Hollywood's elite. It seems a world away from a bookish life in southern New Zealand, but Invercargill's librarians are proving just how loud they can be. The Invercargill City Libraries and Archives social media team has recreated the Kardashians' iconic Hollywood Reporter cover photo for a tongue-in-cheek nod to the family's 10th anniversary of being on New Zealand's screens. The team's graphic designer, Connor Chamberlain, says there are a lot of parallels between the library staff and the famous family.
Invercargill is a classy place, you know, it's sort of high fashion, and I think it emulates the Kardashians very well, so I think that we were a perfect pick for the bunch, really. No, it was just they're having a good laugh, really.
So where did the concept come from?
One of our staff members noticed that it was the Kardashians' 10 years, so we thought it was low-hanging fruit for a good post, really.
And the reaction?
We put up a couple of posts every week, and we always try to make one that's a bit of a personality post, but all of a sudden, after an hour, this one had been up, and it was just going absolutely ballistic.
Ballistic to the tune of almost 7,500 likes and 3,000 shares on Facebook. The image has also been picked up by international media, including the Daily Mail, BuzzFeed and Lad Bible. For Kayla Davidson, the team's digital content creator, the response to the image has been overwhelming.
It came out way better than I expected, and I'm just a bunch of nerves of how crazy this all went. It's really surprising.
So, is she a big fan of the Kardashians?
No. I know who they are, and I knew our audience would like it.
The social media team feels life has to be a mix between work and play, even at the office.
I think you can get too stuck in the work-life ways that you need to make things a bit more fun.
So what's next for Invercargill's aspiring celebrity librarians? Connor Chamberlain says the team plans to build on its success.
We've always got new things on the horizon. I'm not too sure. Seeing as this one's become so popular, we've sort of been talking about possibly doing a couple of other photo shoots, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Yeah, we've always got new plans, so it's just about seeing what we can make relevant and seeing how we can get the library out there and, you know, make sure that people know about us and that we've got a bit more personality than what you usually think about libraries anyway.
In Dunedin for Checkpoint, Timothy Brown.
It really is a wonderful photo. And that brings Checkpoint to an end for tonight. Thank you for being with us. We will be back tomorrow night at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. New Zealand First leaders are still locked in a meeting at Parliament, continuing to weigh up the policy concessions offered by Labour and National. The man who owns the lifestyle block where the Marsden pipeline broke is not picking up his phone. The Waikato District Health Board has apologised unreservedly to the family of an elderly man who died after his hip operation was delayed. And farmers near Christchurch are annoyed their ability to walk stock on some roads could be restricted. Our next news and weather is at 7.
This week on Are We There Yet? It was no longer my daughter, it was full-blown anorexia. Are children's difficult relationship with food?
There's always just, no, I don't want to do it because I'm fat.
And some tips for parents on how to encourage healthy eating.
That might mean you're saying, well, if you want him to do the exercise, the minimum expectation is that you eat this.
Are We There Yet? With me, Katie Gossett, is this